I'm going to give you the more difficult ones, which are absolute value and quadratic, because it is precalculus, right? You like difficult things. Oh my goodness.
Oh, that's not.
Do you like hold your breath when you sneezed or something? Crazy. Okay, so absolute value. Remember when you solve an absolute value equation, there's always two answers because absolute value is distance from 0. So if I said like the absolute value of x equals 3, there's really two numbers that make that true, right? Positive 3 and a negative 3. So when you solve an inequality, there's also two solutions. But because an inequality is, less than or greater than, you get those compound inequalities. You either get an and or an or statement. So if you have an absolute value is less than something, then that is always going to be an and inequality. Right? And we kind of talked about that when we talked about interval notation. Like and usually meet in the middle. So you could say that u is less than a. Here, look, I'll write it over here this way too. I could say u is less than a, and remember that you flip the sign, and then you could say, make that a negative. So u is less than a, and u is greater than negative a. Or you could write it all as one nice little thing. We'll practice. Fancy talk? Not so fancy talk. So if you have an absolute value is greater than something, then that's going to be your or statement. And that's where you could say u is greater than a, or flip the sign and make that part negative. U is less than negative a. And I just used less than signs, but obviously you could use less than or equal to, greater than or equal to as well. So the big thing you have to remember is that there's two options, and that it could be and or. How many other times do you say or? Not very often. And or. Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay. What are you listening to over there, Sean? Are you listening to music?
Oh.
Okay. You just like to keep those near your ears? I hate.
I was earlier.
Okay.
I was. It made me start.
Okay, I'm good. I felt like if you were listening to music and I was talking, that was going to be really hard to but maybe you're super talented at multitasking. But I feel like that's just too much going on at once. Some people love to listen to music while they like take tests and stuff, but that's not me. Like I need just silence. Tell me. I feel like I would type what I'm listening to. I would type what I hear. Like I would hear a word in the song and then I would type that. I think. Like I just need silence. Okay, so when you see absolute value, remember there's two options, and either you can remember less than means and, greater than means or. That's what I always remember. Less than and, greater than or. It's like imprinted on my brain. If you think I'm never going to remember that, I have too much stuff already in my brain. Too many Winnie the Pooh home run derby games. Maybe. There's been other people playing it, but he was the first one. He was playing in my class one day. Maybe what prompted the grumpy post on my thing was Winnie the Pooh. And now it's my go-to example of a terrible waste of a learning device. If you think I'm never going to remember this, you can always just rewrite what's here. So drop the absolute value sign, and you can just say x plus 3 is less than 5. And then you do the same thing on the x side, but you flip the inequality, and you make this side negative. If you do that every time, and you solve it, it will either be in the proper and or, without you having to know if it's an and or. But for me, like I always say, less than means and, so like I know that it should meet the middle when I'm done. If it doesn't, case, or I did this. So, hopefully, the solving this is pretty easy today, right? It's just remembering that there's 2 of them, because all I gotta do to solve this is subtract 3. And if I subtract 3, I would get x is less than 2. And over here, if I subtract 3, I would get x is greater than negative 8. And so, maybe you have to make a number line. What you definitely have to do is you have to write your answer in interval notation. So this is where maybe a number line is going to be helpful, because if I get a number line here from negative 8 to 2, if it's less than 2, then that's going to be parentheses go this way, but it's also greater than negative 8, which would be this way. So maybe you have to know that it's an and, because if you didn't know, if you thought it was an or, that would be one of those weird cases like we did the other day that fills up the whole number line, right? So I think you really have to know.
Stop. No. Push. I don't like
Isn't that crazy? Yeah. That's what we're doing in calculus right now. Infinitely close. How close can we get to 3? Yeah. We need a philosophy. So, on the homework today, I know that you have to write an interval notation. So if you graph it, the interval notation, if it's an and, is just going to be 2 numbers, either brackets or parentheses. So my answer here would be negative 8 to 2. Look at my answer, which is this. So that's an and, everything in between negative 8 and 2, not including negative 8 and 2, because that's not including, right? On the next one is an or statement. So I know that I should have 2 separate inequalities when I'm done. I'm going to do the same thing. So I'll do 3x minus 2 is greater than or equal to 5. Or 3x minus 2, flip the sign and make that negative. So to do this, you have to have that absolute value by itself. So if there's a number outside of that absolute value, you always want to move that over before you do it. Right, so like if it said absolute value of 3x minus 2, and then plus 7. So I would add 2 and get 7. X is greater than or equal to 7 thirds. And it's okay to give improper fractions. Improper fractions are actually preferred. Mixed numbers are okay too. What's really not preferred is repeating decimals, right? Like repeating decimals, yes, it is repeating time. There's nowhere outside of that class you ever use for a number like chemistry and stuff. Other classes, what makes sense is either chemistry or to give me an exact. Okay, what I would mark wrong on this is, what is that, 2 and 1/3? You wrote your answer as 2.3. I would mark that wrong. 3 is not 2.3, right? Right, 2.3 repeating. So just try to learn about fractions. It's right, you just leave it. That's what I try to teach people about. So over here, if I add 2, I would get negative 3. So remember that extra rule, if you multiply or divide both sides by a negative, you have to flip that inequality sign, but that's not here, right? Even though there's a negative over here, I would divide by positive 3. Just remember that rule. This is an or statement, which means theoretically when I graph it, I should get those 2 arrows going in opposite directions. So here's negative 1. I'm going to say here's 7/3. Everything greater than or equal to 7/3 would be a bracket. Everything less than or equal to 1 would also be a bracket. And again, that's like your go-to or statement. If you're going to write this in interval notation, that's where you can use that fancy U. If you feel very smart in pre-cal, you can use fancy U. I a U to say this or that. So how would I write the inequality x is less than or equal to -1? It's everything from -1 all the way down to what? Negative infinity. So it's going to be negative infinity up to -1, right? -1 is as big as it gets with a bracket. And then I can say union. And then on this side, I'm going to start at 7/3, and where am I going to go? To infinity. And remember that infinity and negative infinity always have parentheses. And again, this really just means or. The math word is union. On your homework, like there's a union symbol, and they want you to use the union. I want you to use the union. Okay? Okay, so that's absolute value. The other thing I want to talk about is quadratic inequalities. Quadratic inequalities also have rules, but the best way I think to think about a quadratic inequality is to think about when you graph a quadratic, what does it look like? A parabola. And so I'm not saying that this is what this parabola looks like, because it really isn't. But when you graph a parabola, it's either going to be an and or an or also. Because it's either going to be you're shading inside the parabola, which that would be an and statement, because you would get this part. Or if you shaded outside the parabola, then you would get an or statement, because it would be the two on either side. You with me on that? So, when you do these, step 1 is you're just going to solve the quadratic equation. Kind of forget about the inequality sign. And then step 2, you're going to have to figure out where you shade, which means you're going to kind of have to write check picture rules. Equation, EQ. My handwriting is terrible, so just ask for... EQ is always equation for me. FN is always function. Some abbreviations I always do for math words. Taking enough math stuff in my life. So, yesterday and Friday, we talked about solving quadratic equations. You can factor, you can complete the square, you can do the quadratic formula. Thankfully, most of these, not all of them, most of these are going to be factorable, and so that's the one way we haven't really reviewed yet. But just know if you kind of stink at factoring and you want to do the quadratic formula or complete the square, you're going to get the same answer, right? But I can't factor, so... And I'm going to put an equal sign here so I don't get confused. Last night I might have been complaining on Facebook, and I might have just let it be like a hashtag. But one of my hashtags was, why are things so better than math? Why do you teach everybody? Out for 3 days, last week reviewing how to solve equations, linear basic equations. Yesterday gave us two equations. One is like 7x plus 5 is 3x times 2. And one of them was that had a couple of sides. And they were terrible, awful, and I was having fun along with the equations of the no, yesterday. And my friend who is taking college math lessons right now, she always complains about her college math lessons. She responded to me because math is hard. Hashtag I never get fired from a job because I don't want to factor. And I responded back. She got me doing bigger hashtags. Hashtag I love it. I don't care if you don't like your job. Factor. I stand by my motto. That factoring is hard. I wish I had a job that they would just pay me and they just gave me probability to factor because I was wrong. So I love that. Especially this. It's like it doesn't get better than this with factoring, right? What multiplies to give me x squared, x and x? What multiplies to give me this number that adds to give me the middle number? And choose the right number. The only thing that multiplies to give me 2 is 2 and 1. Your signs have to be what adds to give you 3, so it has to be plus 2. Solving that, right, we get x equals -2, x equals -1. Because I just got it? Yeah. Now, if this was an equation, that would be our answer. But it's not an equation, and here's what people do every single year on tests. I give you a problem to solve like this, and every single year people just bring this less than sign down, and they just put less than, and they're done, and then they're not. Because you have to figure out, am I shading in between those two numbers, or am I shading on the outside of those two numbers? So, check the interval. Here's what I do. Like, I make it a number line, like my x-axis, and I say, well, here would be -2, here would be -1. Because it's a parabola, it's either I'm shading on the inside, or I'm shading on the outside. You really only have to check one interval. You know that? Because if this one works, then that means I'm outside the parabola, and this is going to work. It's going to work. Or if this one works, I'm on the inside, and the outside's not going to work. So my advice is, over here, right? So if I check 0, I'm going to put a little tiny 0 here. You could plug all the way back in the beginning. Plug in your factor card, doesn't matter. But if I plug in 0 here, you just want to know, is that a true statement? So if I plug in 0 here, I would get 0 plus 0 plus 2 is less than 0. That is not true, right? So that does not work, which means by default the inside is it. So am I going to use parentheses or brackets on my interval? Because that's not included, right? So my answer that I would type in would be from -2 to -1. And there's these rules for inequalities also, which sounds like absolute value. Less than means and, greater than means or. But if the x squared is negative, then the opposite's true. And to me, that's just way too long of a rule, which is why I say just check it. It doesn't take that long. Right? Some rules are just okay, let's do that. If I'm going to factor this or do the quadratic formula, what should I do first? Yeah, move that over so it's equal to 0. So I'm going to have 2x squared plus 3x minus 20. Move that over. And I'm going to go ahead and change it to an equal sign so that I don't think about just moving that in the equality sign down. So now this is where factoring gets a little bit more difficult. If you've never enjoyed that factor by grouping and you're really good at quadratic formula, do the quadratic formula. It's going to work. But we could also try to factor this. Here's why some people hate factoring, because it doesn't work, right? Sometimes you try it and it doesn't work. But I just want to review this. You would get a number where you take this number times this number, and you would get -40. And you have to think now, multiply to give you -40, that subtracts to give you 3 in the middle. 8 and -5, and I just said 8x minus 5x. And again, there's some people that just kind of stink at factoring, and that's okay. Do the quadratic formula. It works. Okay. Or my foreign exchange students never factor. They always do the quadratic formula. It always works. Whereas sometimes with factoring, you sit here and you think forever, and then you still have to go to the quadratic formula. I like factoring so much, I can't give it up. Even if the directions say find the factors, like in other countries, they will do the quadratic formula, find the zeros, and then go backwards and find the factors. Okay. No, I love factoring. I can't. I feel like half of my algebra life, when I was in algebra 1, I feel like we spent like months on factoring. And my teacher was like, factor, 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 factor. And so I just was drilled in my head to do it so much. I wouldn't want to do the quadratic formula. I mean, if I had to, but I might secretly factor. Alright, so remember that this is now factored by grouping. So you group these two together and you take out their common factor, which would be a 2x. And what would be left would be x plus 4. And remember that this should have an x plus 4 left too. So if it doesn't, then something's gone wrong. So I have to take out the negative 5, get x plus 4. You take out the part that's the same, so I always take out the x plus 4. And then you combine what's left, which is x minus 5. That's factoring. Then you solve it to get your zeros. Oh, that's right. That's a good question. And then over here, I'm going to add 5 and divide by 2. And again, I'm just going to leave that as 5 halves. You could say 2.5. You could say 2.5. If it's a terminating decimal and you want to be a decimal lover, you can write 2.5. But I'm always going to write the fraction. Questions on where I got those zeros? So then, I just have to figure out whether it's an and or an or. What's wrong? Oh, you change it to 40. Okay, that will change your answer. So my little trick about always picking where 0 is, you just have to make sure you pick the correct spot. Like if for some reason you say 0 is over here, then you're going to get the wrong answer. So you have to make sure that you know, in this case, 0 would be in the middle. Yes? So if I plug 0 in here, and I just always go back to the original, I would get 0 plus 0 is less than or equal to 20. That's true, which means that in this case, I could shade also in the middle. Some people always say, well, how do you know whether it's a bracket or parentheses? Right here. Because that has a line underneath it, tells me that those are included, because that would be a solid line, not a dashed line. So my answer would be negative 4 to 5 halves. And it's parentheses. All right, how do you feel about that? What time do we have? Okay, I'm skipping this one. What comes after this?
I'm just so bad at this stuff.
All right, projectile motion. If I took this pin, that's projectile motion.
It's not possible.
It follows the path of a quadratic. So it says, suppose an object is launched vertically from a point s sub 0 feet from the ground with an initial velocity of v sub 0 feet per second. The vertical position s in feet of the object after t seconds that it's launched is... Ooh, that's scary for people. This is just the initial velocity. Like, how fast did I throw the pin, okay? And it says that up here. And S sub 0 is the initial height. If I'm at ground level, then the initial height could be 0, right? But this is the initial height. And then this actually comes from, do you know where this negative 16 comes from? It's really negative 1/2 gt squared, where g stands for the acceleration due to gravity, which is negative 32 feet per second. And then negative 32, or 32 times, negative 32 times 1/2. No, that's just the acceleration due to gravity. So, like, I don't really know. That's not how fast you do, because it depends on how fast, it depends on what your initial velocity was. You have to use this equation. That's just the effect that gravity has. So, like, if you're on the moon, then this constant changes. Right? Because gravity's different on the moon. Okay? So, Mrs. Hodge about, or not Mrs. Hodge, Miss Dowd about what that means, acceleration due to gravity. I just know that's what it is. It's a constant. So, it says, a projectile is launched straight up from ground level with an initial velocity of 288 feet per second, when will the projectile's height above ground be 1,152 feet? Here's what I'll give you on the test. I will give you this equation. I'll say S equals negative 16 c squared of b sub 0 c of n sub 0. And I'll give you a problem like this. And you got to be able to plug the numbers in, which I don't know that we're going to finish this today, but we'll plug the numbers in and then we can start here tomorrow. Where will that plug 288 feet per second in? Because it's the initial velocity. And what is S sub 0 in this problem? Ground level, because I don't have to add anything here, it's just called 0. And then it says, when will the projectile's height be 1,152 feet? Yeah, that is the height. So I want to know, like, this is the equation to say how high will it go. So if I want to know when it's here, and I put this, well, it's plus 0 because we're at ground level. It does look less scary when you plug it in. And now we just have a quadratic with really big numbers. Would be great if all this is divisible by 16, yes? I think it is, but it's okay if it's not. You could do the quadratic formula, you could complete the square, you could factor this. What I want you to do is to try to look at this. There's some on your homework. I think there's one like this on your homework. And tomorrow we'll talk about it, and then you can go back and fix it if you want, because we don't have enough time. But from this step, we want to solve this, and we're looking for time. So normally in a quadratic we get 2 answers. We could have 2 answers. But if one of those is negative, we can't have a negative time, right? Think about that. I don't know. We just have to wait and see what's happening. So, all right. So we're going to pause here, and we'll pick this up tomorrow. But I still want you on your homework. I think there's only one of these on the Math Excel homework. I want you to try those absolute value and those quadratics. And tomorrow we'll have some time that you can work on it as well if you don't get it all done. But we'll start with this problem tomorrow, okay?